Okay, hello everyone. Matel, thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's really a great pleasure and an honor to be back here at the Tel Aviv University where I grew up and to present my new research that I'm conducting at the Weizmann Institute. So, as Batel said, I'm currently a postdoc at the Weizmann Institute with Victor Steinberg, where we are studying flows that are supplemented with or fluids that are supplemented with polymers inside of them, making them viscoelastic fluids. And today I will tell you about the elastic instability and elastic waves that we have observed in a weakly perturbed channel flow of these viscoelastic fluids. Okay. So for those of you who don't know, I will start with an introduction. So apparently, if we take a regular fluid, so for example, water, and we just mix into this water some long polymer chains, then they will generally assume an equilibrium position, which we call a coiled state. So these polymers look something like that in their equilibrium position, something like a cotton ball of these long chains intertwined between themselves. However, if we start making this fluid flow somehow, for example, by steering it, we can cause velocity gradients that act on these cotton balls of polymer chains, which can rotate these polymers, which can stretch them and can deform them. So as I said, we have the polymer, they're usually coiled, but then velocity gradients can stretch them. And because we are stretching these polymers, they tend to resist back on the flow, and then I apply back on the fluid what we call elastic stresses. The important thing to understand is that the polymers induce nonlinearities in the fluid equations of motion. And this has several reasons. So for example, as I said, these polymers can move, they can change their shape, their orientation, etc. So this is one type of nonlinearity that the polymers exert in the fluid. They also have a finite memory. So if we take this cotton ball and we stretch it, it takes a finite amount of time to relax back into its coiled state. And this relaxation time is what we denote as lambda. And it can reach several seconds and even several minutes in magnitude. The third mechanism that could lead to nonlinearity is simply due to the fact that some polymers have a nonlinear stress deformation relation. So the relation between the amount of stretching that we apply on the polymers and the amount of stress that they act back can be a nonlinear function. And all of these different mechanisms, we quantify them using a non-dimensional parameter that we call the Weisenberg number. So the Weisenberg number is defined right here as this relaxation time divided by the characteristic time for deformation of fluid elements. In my talk in particular, I will use this relaxation, the following definition of the Weisenberg number, being the relaxation time times the characteristic velocity divided by the characteristic length scale of the flow. And these nonlinearities, importantly, lead to a wide array of strange and complex behaviors that we can call elastic instabilities, and even to a state that's called elastic turbulence. So for example, the flow right here in this image between two of these obstacles to the flow. So even though the separation between these obstacles is very small, only 0.3 millimeters, we can see still the development of vortices in between these two obstacles. In this image, for example, we see a very low Reynolds number flow. The Reynolds number of this obstacle is only equal to 3, but still upstream of this obstacle, we can see a complex distribution of streamlines that's generated by these tracers inside of the flow. In this example, we have what's called a cross-slot flow. So the fluid comes in from both sides into this device and leaves through the top and the bottom outlets. And this, again, leads to an elastic instability with, for example, leads to a chaotic velocity time series that can be seen in this graph. Another example is simply a contraction in a pipe. So here we have a large pipe, a pipe with a large diameter connected to a pipe with a smaller diameter. And again, a velocity time series will have this very significant fluctuating component. And lastly, in this image right here, we see a snapshot from an experiment in which elastic turbulence was reported. This is basically a chaotic flow state that can exist even at almost zero Reynolds number values. And still we have a chaotic flow with a very steep energy spectrum of the velocity and concentration of additives, etc. So one of the mechanisms that leads to such elastic instabilities was revealed by Packnell and McKinley back in 1996. The basic or the fundamental ingredient that they have in the mechanism of their elastic instability is portrayed here, and it's basically the curved streamline geometry. So they observed that if we have a base flow, which is curved like that, then very small fluctuations of the polymers from the initial radial position can cause them to be stretched very strongly, which eventually leads to what we call a hoop stress. And this stress acts perpendicular to these curved streamlines and causes a buildup of pressure in this region, which then leads to an elastic instability. However, in contrast to that, flows with straight streamlines are considered linearly stable. So if we have, for example, a channel flow, as we see right here, these theoretical analyses by various authors have shown that these flows are linearly stable. This means that very small perturbations to these kinds of flows should decay exponentially, right? So we should not basically observe any elastic turbulence or any elastic instability if we are counting on this linearized theory. But are they really stable? So apparently not. Two separate competing theories have shown that due to nonlinear mechanisms, we can still see elastic instabilities that occur in such straight flows. So for example, this theory by Jovanovic and Kumar was developed and presented in 2011, and they described one type of mechanism that can cause the appearance of elastic instabilities. Essentially, it's a nonlinear mechanism. I'm not going to go into the details. And then the second theory was developed by Molenbroek, by Morozov and their co-workers in 2004. And again, they showed that there is a nonlinear subcritical instability that can develop in these straight shear flow geometries. So essentially, the important thing to understand here is that despite these flows are linearly stable, if we excite them in the right way, meaning we have a strong enough perturbation or in the correct form, then we can eventually lead to an elastic instability. And these two theories were eventually even shown to be true in experiment, to exist in experiments. So for example, this experiment right here, these are two papers describing the same experiment. It's a channel flow experiment. This channel is actually a micro channel. Its width is only 90 microns. And at the inlet, they put, the inlet of this channel, they put a lot of cylinders. They kind of block the flow and cause an initial very strong perturbation. And then they observed the fluid velocity using PIV downstream, very far away from these cylinders. And right here in this picture, they show that the initial disturbance grows and turns into this fluctuating velocity profile. So here we have a space-time plot, in which the colors show deviations of the fluid velocity from its average value as a function of time and space. The second experiment was performed by Narsingh Jha and Victor Steinberg in our lab. This experiment is again a channel flow. So again, straight streamline geometry, but a very long channel. So this is a 0.5 meter long channel. However, its height is only 1/2 of a millimeter, so the Reynolds number is still very low. And then again, at the inlet of this channel, they put a lot of these cylinders that kind of block the flow and create a very strong perturbation. And then they saw that initially the strength of the fluctuations grows very strongly near this perturbation source, but then it decays with the streamwise distance. However, then it grows back up again. And this growth back up again of these fluctuations of here for the velocity gradients suggests that indeed we have an intrinsic nonlinear mechanism that causes this growth of the perturbations in these low Reynolds number channel flows of viscoelastic fluids. The main characteristics of these kinds of instabilities can be shown by observing the power spectrum for the velocity time series. So this is a characteristic image that we can get in experiments. The first characteristic is shown here. It's a high energy peak for the velocity that occurs at low frequencies. This peak is associated with a phenomenon that we call elastic waves. And I will discuss about that more later. And then the second characteristic is shown right here. This is a power law decay of the spectrum of the energy in the flow. And it usually is characterized by a very steep power law decay. So here we have a minus 3.2 decay rate for this energy spectrum, which suggests that we have an elastic turbulent state in this strongly perturbed viscoelastic channel flow. So essentially we saw that even though these viscoelastic channel flows are considered linearly stable, disturbances can grow in them simply due to some non-linear mechanisms. And the question that I want to ask today, discuss today with you, is how sensitive are these flows to the initial disturbances in these channels? I will try to answer that by showing you experimental results that I have from a channel flow experiment in which the disturbances to the flow were very carefully monitored. So here is the experiment. As I said, I used the channel flow experiment. So this is a schematic illustration of my channel. The channel is long. It's 750 millimeters, which is long in our context at least. The height of the channel is only 0.5 millimeter. So again, the Reynolds number is very low in this experiment, as we shall see. However, here at the inlet of the experiment, I smoothed very, very, very carefully all of the inlet to this channel, and all of the connections were tapered very carefully, in order to make sure that we don't have any unwanted perturbation to my channel flow. In addition to that, right at the center of the channel, right here, we have a cavity, meaning that I took a drill, a CNC machine, took a drill and drilled a very small hole through the top cover of this channel. So this is shown right here. And this cavity is the only source of perturbation that we have for this flow, right? This is the only thing that can cause any perturbation to the fluid that is not related to the channel itself. Inside of this channel, I used a very viscous sugar syrup as a working fluid. And to that, I added 230 ppm of polyacrylamide polymer chains, which generates basically a viscoelastic fluid. And this viscoelastic fluid has a viscosity that is roughly 125 times higher than that of water, and the characteristic relaxation time of roughly 12.1 seconds. This means that the Reynolds number in all of my experiments, everything that I'm going to show you, is much smaller than 1. However, the Weisenberg number is much larger than 1, which will eventually lead to the instabilities that we will see. And the elasticity number, defined as the Weisenberg number divided by the Reynolds number, is again much, much, much higher than 1. It equals roughly 5,000 in my experiment. So this is the setup. In order to measure the fluid, the flow, I did 2 separate experiments. In the first one, I used PAV. So I have a camera and I have a laser, and then I seeded the flow with small tracer particles, which looks something like that. I took double images, pairs of images at various time intervals, and then inspected the translation of the particles in between these two images. And then using the OpenPIV software, we can extract the fluid velocity as a function of time and as a function of space. So we have the fluid velocity as a function of x and z, meaning the streamwise coordinate and the span-wise coordinate of the channel. And in addition to that, we conducted pressure measurements. So we have also connected a pressure transducer to the cavity itself. This was then connected to the computer, and it allowed us to see whether we have a fluctuating or a non-fluctuating pressure time series in our experiments. Let's see the results. The first section of my results, I will show that we do have an instability just simply due to the presence of this cavity in the flow. And this is shown right here in this graph. So here we have the pressure fluctuations. So I take the pressure signal, I subtract the average pressure, and I have just the pressure fluctuations as a function of time right here. And I plot it for various Weisenberg numbers. So here for the blue data, for example, it's shown for Weisenberg number equal 46. And we see only very weak fluctuations that I associate with an experimental noise. However, as I very gradually increase the Weisenberg number, so for example, right here in this series, I reached to a Weisenberg number of roughly 360, and we can see quite significant fluctuations, right? If we double that, the Weisenberg number, we see again that the fluctuations increase even more than that. So we have a fluctuation intensity for the pressure signal right at the cavity that grows with the Weisenberg number. In order to characterize this transition, we use a property that we call the reduced PRMS. So we have this delta RMS, the reduced pressure fluctuation, which equals the RMS of the pressure signal divided by basically the noise level in our experiments minus 1. So we have, if this equals 0, it means that we don't have any fluctuations in the flow except experimental noise. And then I plot here this reduced pressure fluctuation as a function of the Weisenberg number for the polymer solution. And we see that as I increase the Weisenberg number, it starts to gradually increase and increase and increase until it reaches roughly 40 times the noise level in my experiment. However, for the Newtonian solvent, we can see that the pressure fluctuations don't increase at all, at the same corresponding Reynolds number shown at the top of this graph. So basically fitting this blue data by a power law with this onset value for the transition, we can find that we have a critical Weisenberg number for the appearance of this elastic instability, which is equal to roughly 125. And we have a power law growth for the strength of this fluctuation, which is equal to roughly to 1.85. Yeah, we have power law growth for the strength of these fluctuations. Another way to see that we have a transition to a new state in the flow is by observing the power spectrum for these pressure fluctuations. So here we have in blue the pressure power spectrum for Weisenberg number of 32, and we see that it roughly has a power law with a slope of roughly -2, which suggests that we have simply experimental noise. However, as we increase the Weisenberg number, we see that the slope changes value and becomes much steeper. So we have -3.75 for the Weisenberg number of 520, and we have -3.2 for Weisenberg number roughly 3 times higher than that, which means that we qualitatively have different kinds of fluctuations that occur for the pressure signals as we increase the Weisenberg number. So in the previous 2 slides, I showed you pressure measurements right here at the cavity itself. But what happens slightly downstream from the cavity? In order to see that, we have to focus on the PIV results. So here I'm showing, in this graph, I'm showing results for the mean velocity profile inside of my channel. For the lowest Weisenberg number case, right, for the Weisenberg number of 35 before the transition, the profile looks really like a plug flow. This plug flow exactly corresponds to the laminar flow solution. If I would put here the analytical solution that you can compute for Stokes flow, you would see that it matches exactly this solution. However, as the Weisenberg number increases, we see a strange phenomenon. we can see a development of this kind of indentation that occurs in the velocity profile. So as for Weisenberg number equal 95, we see a very weak indentation right here. But for Weisenberg number of 200, we can see a very pronounced indentation, right? This kind of shape of the velocity profile. So essentially, this cavity through the top hole drilled in the channel somehow leaves this kind of a wake behind it, which is associated with basically with elastic stresses, as we shall see. In addition to that, I also did an experiment to see how this indentation grows. So here in this experiment, I conducted a very long measurement of PIV measurements of roughly 4 hours, in which I very gradually increased the Weisenberg number in the channel flow by increasing the velocity. And here the blue data that you see has a downward trend exactly shows the increase of this indentation. So the velocity at the center of the channel very slowly decreases, while the velocity at the side of the channel right here very gradually increases as we increase the Weisenberg number. In addition to that, in addition to this development of this indentation in the velocity, in the mean velocity profile, we saw very strong fluctuations that start to appear as we increase the Weisenberg number. So again, here we see a velocity time series for Weisenberg number of roughly 120, which is roughly flat. I mean, almost no fluctuation at all. However, as we increase the Weisenberg number to 300, we see pronounced fluctuations that again grow and grow as we increase the Weisenberg number more. In this figure, which shows the profile of the fluctuations intensity, this is just the velocity RMS divided by the mean flow velocity in the channel, we can see that these fluctuations are mostly concentrated in the center of the channel, right at the wake that this cavity for some reason generates, and that these fluctuations again grow with the Weisenberg number. So again, in order to characterize the transition using the velocity signals, we use this kind of reduced velocity fluctuations, which equals the velocity RMS divided by the noise level -1. And we again see that at a critical Weisenberg number of roughly 125, a power law, roughly a power law increase in the strength of the fluctuations. Here, the exponent of the power law growth equals to roughly 0.7. However, after that, it roughly saturates. So the fluctuation roughly saturate after that. And in addition to that, like we saw in the pressure signal, we see a steepening of the power spectrum. So for Weisenberg 270, the power spectrum for the velocity was roughly flat. However, it became steeper and steeper as we increased the Weisenberg number, higher and higher, up to 2000. So what causes all of this mess that I just showed you? So if we go back to the beginning of the talk, I said that velocity gradients can stretch polymers, and that these polymers can act back on the flow through nonlinear mechanisms. And indeed, this was shown experimentally by Smith, Babcock, and Chu in a very famous experiment back in 1999. They did a very simple shear flow experiment in which they used a microscope to observe fluorescent dyed polymer chains, and they saw that they extended up to roughly 40% of their maximum length, simply due to this shear induced in the channel, in their apparatus. However, more recently, roughly 11 years ago, Liu and Steinberg in our lab showed that polymer stretching can become much more significant if we just add random fluctuations on the flow. So in the shear case, as the polymers stretch by the velocity gradients, they also rotate, and eventually they reach the same alignment with the streamwise velocity. So they have a maximum level to which they can be stretched. But if we then add random fluctuations by some source to these polymers, they can lose their alignment and become stretched even further. So they showed, Liu and Steinberg showed in their experiment that they reach up to 80% of the maximum length of their experiment simply using fluctuations in their flow. And then they parameterized this observation of significant lengthening of the polymers using an effective Weisenberg number that's defined using the relaxation time of the polymers times the RMS of the velocity gradients in the channel. And we can see that as the Weisenberg number, the effective Weisenberg number increases, we see more and more stretching of the polymers. So by the time we reach an effective Weisenberg number of roughly 20, the polymers reach roughly 70% of their full length. So what happens in our flow? Here I plot the local or the effective Weisenberg number as a function of the macroscopic Weisenberg number in the channel. We can see that as we cross this roughly 125 critical Weisenberg number limit, we see a very strong increase of this component du dz of its fluctuations, which suggests actually bypasses this level of effective Weisenberg number that is equal to 20 and continues to grow, which suggests that this indented shape of the polymer in this wake of the cavity can significantly stretch the polymers much more than their original length and then cause nonlinear mechanisms and strong fluctuations in the flow. So this was the first part of the results that I showed, that I have to show. The second part will focus on the appearance of elastic waves. So what are elastic waves? I can just check my clock. Okay. Let me first give you some theory for these elastic waves. So following the theory that was developed by Balkovsky, by Fuxon and Lebedev in the beginning of the 2000s, they showed that if we take an Ondroid B fluid, this is a specific equation of motion for such polymeric viscoelastic fluids. And if we, again, on top of that, if we assume that the polymer stress, which is essentially a tensor, can be specified using this director vector, right? So we can write this polymer stress tensor as Bi times Bj, where B is called the director vector. Then we get the following equations of motion for the fluid. So the first equation is simply the Navier-Stokes equation. We have the material derivative, we have the pressure gradient term, we have the viscous stress term, plus this new term that arises due to the elastic stress, to the gradients of the elastic stress due to the presence of the polymers. And to this, we add the second equation, which governs the evolution of elastic stresses. So they, again, have a material derivative term. They have a nonlinear term that couples this stretching of the polymers back into the velocity field, plus a relaxation term that causes exponential decay of these elastic stresses. Now, in addition to that, if we make further quite strong assumptions that we have high elasticity in the flow, meaning that we have strong elastic stresses compared to the viscous stresses. If we further assume that we have very fast fluctuations compared to this relaxation time, and if we assume that the elastic stress can be written as a base stress vector in some direction, plus small fluctuations above it, and if we use a Lagrangian frame of reference, meaning that we move with the fluid in the channel, then what we obtain eventually are these two very simplified equations for the two components of the elastic stress vector and of the velocity vector. So we have the velocity component in the x direction and the elastic stress component in the x direction as well. And they obey these two equations. And these equations are very nice because they're essentially wave equations. They have wave solutions for these two components, in which the wave velocity is simply Bz, right? So simply taking the derivative of this and respectively this, combining them with each other will give us a wave equation with Bz being the wave velocity. And this solution is exactly analogous to what people call the Alfvén waves in magnetohydrodynamics, were discovered back in the 1940s. So to give a bit of intuition about these waves, we can imagine these polymers being stretched, right? And this stretching of the polymers acts as sort of strings. So when we pluck these strings, we have waves, transverse waves traveling along these strings. So this is exactly what we have here. back in 2010, Berti and Bofetta reported similar some oscillations in a two-dimensional Kolmogorov flow in a DNS, and these oscillations might be these elastic waves. And very recently, 2 years ago, Atul Varshney and Victor Steinberg from our lab observed elastic instabilities, elastic waves, and elastic turbulence in between two obstacles that are found in the flow. However, the waves in their experiment were very big. The wave number was much larger than their window of observation. So they couldn't really see the waves themselves. In what follows, I will show you that we have elastic waves in our channel as well. Plus, we have a special configuration of these elastic waves, which allows us to see the full waves and confirm their dispersion relation for the first time. So here, now I'm focusing on the PAV results, but further more downstream than I showed you before. And in this graph, I'm showing basically the power spectrum of the velocity time series as a function of the Weisenberg number right at the center of the channel. What it shows us is that we have distinct peaks in the power spectrum, and these peaks change their position and change their height with the Weisenberg number. So for the lower Weisenberg number, we have low frequency peaks, but these peaks grow to higher frequency as we increase the Weisenberg number. So we have basically coherent oscillations in our velocity time signals downstream from the location of the elastic instability. In order to show you the structure or what it roughly looks like, then I plot, for example, in this figure, I plot a lot of black lines. In each of these black lines corresponds to a velocity time series that was bandpass filtered in order to remove the noise that does not allow us to really see the structure very well. And doing this operation for various locations inside of the channel, we get this kind of structure of the waves. We can see these crests going diagonally in the channel, right? This is the time axis, and this is the spine noise position axis. And we see that we have wave crests that form these diagonal lines along the channel, and that the angle of these wave crests changes. Actually, it increases with the Weisenberg number. So this is for Weisenberg 380, 580, and finally 808. So the angle changes. If we really want to see the structure of these waves clearly, we can just phase average these velocity time series at the same frequency of oscillation that we saw before. And this is roughly the picture that we get. This is an experimental image that was obtained by just phase averaging the results at a Weisenberg number of 460. And it shows that we have a wavy structure for the velocity, for the streamwise velocity component, which really agrees well with this mathematical form, which means that we have wave crests moving in the spanwise direction from the sides of the channel into the center of the channel. So these are basically traveling waves of the streamwise velocity that move in the spanwise direction, right? These are transverse waves. In order to extract parameters for these waves, we can use these kind of contour plots. So again, this is spanwise coordinate, and this is time. So we can measure the frequency of the waves just by counting the time that it takes this pattern to repeat itself. We can measure the wave number or the wavelength simply by counting the distance at which these patterns repeat themselves. And we can estimate the wave velocity by looking at the angle that these constant contours form. And here I show you the results as a function of the Weisenberg number. So in this subplot right here, I'm plotting the wavelength as a function of the Weisenberg number first. It shows that the wavelength was roughly almost constant throughout our experiments and did not show a significant dependent on the Weisenberg number, despite some random fluctuations. Here, I plot the frequency of the waves as a function of the Weisenberg number. And we see that it very clearly, the frequency increases with the Weisenberg number, as we saw before in the spectrum, in the spectra. And we can also fit this growth with the power law expression right here, for which we obtain a critical Weisenberg number of roughly 125 and an exponent of roughly 0.72 in agreement with previous observations. Plus, here I plot just the frequency times the wave length versus the wave velocity at the psicha, which shows that they exactly are correlated with each other. So the fact that F times L equals V, the wave velocity, to the experimental uncertainty, means that we have a linear dispersion relation for these waves, as was predicted by the theory for elastic waves I presented earlier. And here, lastly, I present the wave velocity as a function of the wave number. It can be seen to roughly grow as the same power law that we had for the frequency, despite some random fluctuations that occurred due to the fluctuations in the wavelength that we had as a function of the Weisenberg number. So to conclude my talk, I showed you a channel flow in which I put a viscoelastic fluid. I presented to you pressure measurements right at the cavity that is in the center of this channel. And we saw that as the Weisenberg number increases, we see random fluctuations in pressure. Downstream from that, we see that we have a development of this kind of indented velocity profile that can significantly stretch the polymer chains that are found inside of this flow. And then further downstream from that, once these chaotic fluctuations have decayed, we saw the presence of elastic waves right here at this region. So the take-home message that I have is the following. Despite the linear stability of these flows, viscoelastic channel flows can exhibit instabilities. They can exhibit waves and random fluctuations, even due to very weak disturbances. And this means that if we are modeling such flows, we need to be very, very careful in what we're doing. Thank you very much.